Good afternoon and welcome to this session hosted by RAMP and the All-Party Parliamentary Group concerned with migration and refugees. We're going to be looking today at the issue of the impact of the government's proposals on the new plan for immigration on local government. My name is David Simmons. I'm the Member of Parliament for Resettlement North and Pinner. I spent more than 20 years of my life as a local councillor in the London Borough of Hillingdon, which is host to Heathrow Airport. And that's one of the reasons why I became very much involved over the years in the work that local government has done, both on the specific support that we have in place for refugees, whether that's refugee children, unaccompanied asylum seekers, families, and then subsequently the Refugee Resettlement Scheme, the VPRS, the Syrian scheme, where local authorities came forward with offers of help to enable resettlement into the UK, following David Cameron's pledge to resettle around 20,000 vulnerable people following the war in Syria. And it's been very clear to me throughout that time that migration, whilst it is a matter of national government policy, has a huge impact on the way that local authorities go about their business. So today, as well as a gathered audience of people from across the local authority, parliamentary, refugee, NGO sector, and policy sector, we have a panel of people with particular expertise who are able to inform the discussion that we're going to have about how the new plan for immigration is going to change the impact that local authorities experience and how it may perhaps either make things worse or improve some of the challenges that councils have faced over many, many years. And examples of that are that the proposals to change the way in which people are granted protection in the UK will mean that local authorities may see an increase in the population of people with no recourse to public funds and a temporary right to be in the UK. The National Transfer Scheme, which enables unaccompanied children to be moved around the country, got off to a reasonable start, but debates about the funding of it and the willingness of children to be moved and whether that is something which is legal under the infrastructure that supports children in the care system remain significant challenges. And of course, COVID has put a huge spotlight on the way that our borders operate. I'm conscious, for example, that the London Borough of Hillingdon has more than half of the quarantine hotels for the entirety of England within its borders. And that means significant issues for local social workers who are dealing with families facing difficult times, children who may be unaccompanied whilst in transit, and the response that that requires from a local authority. Now, the speakers that we have are all people with highly relevant experience. And the first is going to be Councillor Roger Gough. Roger is someone who I declare for the record I've known for a good many years. He's been a very strong colleague and his local authority has been enormously active in seeking to influence and shape the debate about immigration policy because of the direct impact that Kent County Council as the front line for the port of Dover, people crossing the Channel and arriving often for the first time in the UK and beginning their journey through the British asylum system. Because that clearly has a huge impact on his community. Now, I know Roger himself, prior to becoming the leader of Kent County Council, was also the lead member there for Children's Services. So he's somebody who has enormous experience in respect of those young people and their journey through the system as well. Our second panellist is Catherine Holcroft, who is a Principal Project Officer and No Recourse to Public Funds Network. And that term is one which applies to the visas of people who are allowed to be in the UK, maybe to work, but have no recourse to public funds, i.e. the benefit system, in the event that things go wrong for them. And clearly, local authorities, dating back to the National Assistance Act and Children's Services legislation, have responsibilities to step in when people find themselves at risk of destitution. But the confusion and the muddle between what national government intends and what this means in practice is one that is at the heart of a lot of the challenges that councils face. We'll then hear from Councillor Jennifer Leyden, who's the convener for Community Empowerment, Equalities and Human Rights at Glasgow City Council. Glasgow plays a huge role in the support for refugees, and it's always one of the striking elements of the debate about the dispersal of refugees, that if we look at Scotland, we have a huge number placed in Glasgow. Many of those who may gain status may, for example, head to Edinburgh, but they're not placed there by central government, which means a significant burden being borne by City Council that needs to respond. And then lastly, we're going to hear from Rupinder Pahar, who's the Senior Immigration Project Coordinator at the Greater London authority. And the GLA clearly has a role, although not direct, in dealing with migration, in managing the consequences of that for the whole of London. And we've seen, for example, with the London Borough of Croydon, host to Luna House, where people often, for the first time, lodge their asylum claim, having overwhelming numbers of refugee children to look after. The ability of the capital as a whole to respond and make sure that people are appropriately supported is incredibly significant. So I'd like to hand over now to Councillor Roger Gough. I know, Roger, you have an audience of more than 100 people with a real interest in the way that we can improve this and the way that we can make sure as it makes its way through the parliamentary process, we influence what ends up being in this new plan for immigration and ensure that it's something which is constructive and has a positive impact on local government and the communities which it's there to serve. Roger.
Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, everyone. As David mentioned, I'm the leader of Kent County Council, have been since October 2019. I also chair the South East Strategic Partnership for Migration, though I think much of what I say in the next few minutes will be focused, as I think David indicated, on the Kent County Council experience. And in particular, our current situation, recurring situation, in relation to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and how some elements of the new plan for immigration may affect that. As I think is widely known now, because it's been getting an awful lot of coverage, Kent has 3 times now, over the last 5 or 6 years, experienced very rapid numbers of arrivals of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Asylum seekers in general who arrive in Kent, most of them do not stay in the county, but are subject to the National Dispersal Scheme. A partial exception to that has been the use of the Napier Barracks near Folkestone, a point I will return to at the end. But by and large, the area of ongoing involvement for the county and for the county council has been in relation to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. This year, we are currently taking in, or have until we ceased acceptance under our statutory duties a week ago, we had already taken far more young people into our care than at the same time last year. We have some 429 under 18s in our care. That is compared with a National Transfer Scheme protocol guideline, it's a bit more than a guideline, of 231 as the maximum level we should have. And critically, what we have seen, I should also mention actually we have nearly 1,100 care leavers of asylum-seeking background within our service as well, actually making up a majority of the care leavers whom we serve. So it's worth looking at how that has tied into some very, very particular factors recently and how that then relates to the new plan for immigration. And the first element is, of course, that routes used for these young people to arrive in the country have shifted over the last couple of years. And in particular, this much greater reliance on the small boats across the short straits between the French coast and Kent. There's actually quite an interesting chart, or table rather, in the new plan, which shows how that proportion has increased dramatically to over 50% in the course of 2020. And that, as I say, has inevitably meant that within what's overall been a diminishing total of asylum seekers reaching this country, a much higher proportion have come to the shores of Kent. Now, if we look at what that means now, or what's the provisions of the new plan might mean for an authority such as us, and many of these points would apply equally to others who have found themselves or might find themselves again in a similar situation. The first is that the principle, and I emphasize the point, simply the principle of relying on and privileging what are described as legal routes, and seeking to encourage that and discourage the alternatives without making any value judgments on it whatsoever. There is no doubt that that would, were it to be effective, make a significant difference to port of entry authorities, because at the moment it is through those ports of entry that claims are immediately made. There are clearly huge questions as to how that would actually work in practice. the linkage of it to the emphasis on resettlement schemes, but not a great deal of detail on that within the new plan, and indeed how return agreements with other countries, such as France, most relevantly in this case, would work post the Dublin arrangements. So the principle is one that, in the sense, would make a favourable difference to port of entry authorities. The practice, I think there's a very big question as to how that would actually work. The second question, which I think is of importance in thinking about this, is the role of temporary protection status. Others, I think, will speak about the linkage of that into no recourse to public funds and so on. I'm just raising the question that I don't think it's clear. Others may have a different view on this from me. I don't think it is clear at the moment how that actually applies, if it applies at all, to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. At the moment, it is not through an asylum claim, but it is rather through what is called you ask leave to remain, that these young people first stay in the country and in the county. And meanwhile, the county council takes responsibility under the provisions of the Children Act, and particularly Section 20 of the Children Act. Now, as far as I can see, the shift towards reliance on temporary protection status for those who've come from a country like France would not, I think, make any difference to that. And what is interesting is that already we have a significant difference between somebody who is established as arriving in this country at the age of 17 and a half, and their colleague, their friend perhaps, who arrives at 18 and a half and is established as such. And what paths they go through different parts of the system, through the entire children in care system, and particularly care leaver system in the case of the one, and through the adult dispersal and asylum system on the other. Clearly, in this case, you would actually add to that by the fact that the older of those two would presumably be going through the temporary protection status system with all its particular features, whereas although that would apply, one would imagine, in a sense, to those who have arrived from, let us say, France as children, nonetheless, that would be to a certain extent trumped, particularly on a day-to-day basis, by the provisions under the Children Act. Second element I just wish to touch on is the National Age Assessment Board and the proposals that are brought forward on that. Now, in principle, that is something which I think we have quite a lot of sympathy for, and indeed it has grown out of, and the focus on that has grown out of the experience that we've had in Kent and the work between the Home Office and Kent over the last year. However, I would throw in the point that this cannot be disentangled from, as David mentioned, issues such as the National Transfer Scheme, because at the moment we have a situation where age-assessed young people, age-challenged young people are not de facto transferred to other authorities. Certainly whilst that challenge is going on, in theory, under the National Transfer Scheme protocol, that could take place. In practice, it doesn't, and that's been very much part of the mechanisms by which we, working with the Home Office and others, have coped with seeking to place many of these young people outside of Kent over the last year. And there is also, of course, the whole question of legal challenge, and although the plan does talk in terms of an accelerated process, it's worth noting, just to give you an example or some stats on that, over the period between September and February, we had some 90 young people who were age assessed. 56 of them were found to be of a different age to that which was claimed. 44 initially assessed, therefore, to be an adult. 12 still to be children, but to be older than the claim. Well, of those 56, some 47, we had at least some degree of legal oversight of what was presented under the age assessment. Some 39 pre-action letters, and 24 have actually gone into judicial review, and others may yet follow. So there is still potentially quite a protracted process, and that has, as I say, some interaction with how transfers would work. The final point I would make is the emphasis on reception centres. an interesting point, but simply one that for us in Kent has some relevance, because as I mentioned at the start, we did not until last year have any adults stay, or any significant number of adults staying in Kent after their initial arrival. The government established their centre at the Napier Barracks near Folkestone, and through all the various tribulations that have been associated with that, are still very keen, clearly, to maintain that. And I think it is interesting when you think of that in the context of the emphasis put on reception centres and their importance to the plan. So I'll leave it there, David. I hope that covers off a few key points, and we're very happy to take matters up during the discussion later.
Thank you very much, Roger. Insightful and also very clear about the complexity, really, of the challenge that faces local authorities. We're now going to hear from Catherine Holcroft, who's going to talk a bit about the cross-party work of the No Recourse to Public Funds group, as well as her direct experiences in the London Borough of Islington. So, Catherine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, David. Just to clarify, I spoke to RAMP, and really I'm going to focus on the NRPF risks arising from the plan. And before I do that, I really want to start by setting out the context in which the plan will be implemented, because I think that's important for everyone to be aware of. Now, I think it's fair to say that action taken by local authorities to accommodate people with NRPF through Everyone In has certainly saved lives. But as David mentioned in the introduction, long before we were hit by the pandemic, social services have been safeguarding the welfare of children, care leavers and adults with care and support needs by providing accommodation and financial support when people are excluded from mainstream benefits by their immigration status. Now, this safety net, which is costing 68 councils around £57 million a year, has been recognised by the courts as being essential to protect children from destitution, and has also enabled governments to deny particular groups of migrants access to benefits. However, central government doesn't fund local government to provide this support, despite such intervention clearly being a necessary response to alleviate destitution that's been driven by these exclusionary immigration policies, such as the imposition of the NRPF condition. Now, additionally, various procedural barriers that people face when pursuing immigration claims and the lack of legal aid all contribute to delays in establishing sustainable outcomes when people are supported. So, and for the majority of people, that outcome will be a grant of leave to remain, enabling access to employment and benefits. Now, our data actually shows that 79% of families exiting support will do so following a grant of leave to remain, but they will have been in need of local authority support for an average period of 1.5 years before achieving this outcome. Now, for adults with care needs, this increases to a period of 2.5 years on average. So there are two proposals in the plan that are particularly concerning, especially as they are likely to be being implemented at a time when local authorities are going to be dealing with the consequences of what is an unknown number of European citizens who become unlawfully present and excluded from services from the 1st of July. So first of all, the proposal to introduce temporary protection leave has been mentioned already, and this will certainly create a new group of people who are subject to the hardship of the NRPF condition unless they are destitute. Now, temporary protection leave will also leave people, and let's just remember that these are people that the Home Office will have found to be at risk of persecution and unable to return to their country of origin, and they will be left on a very uncertain and insecure immigration journey. They won't be able to settle in the UK if the Home Office fails to return them to a safe European country, so this is likely to create a lot of barriers to their being able to integrate. And then, of course, should people fall into destitution, they may be reliant on their local authority to intervene and provide support whilst they're seeking remedy to their NRPF status with the Home Office. Now, secondly, the government proposes to consult with local authorities on implementing measures that are already passed by Parliament in the 2016 Immigration Act to withdraw asylum support from people who are appeal rights exhausted. Now, this is currently provided to families and also to adults who are able to show that they can't leave the UK or perhaps are pursuing a fresh asylum claim. Now, the absence of Home Office support, which for people with who are appeal rights exhausted, which will only be provided in very, very limited circumstances, will create destitution risks if people don't take up voluntary return immediately after receiving the final refusal on their asylum claim. It's also going to result in a clear shift of statutory and financial responsibility for providing support from central to local government. And that's particularly going to apply when families and adults with care needs are destitute and are unable to leave the UK. But many adults are going to be left without any access to statutory support unless we're in a period of time where local authority intervention is required to save lives during a public health emergency, or perhaps when the severe weather emergency protocols are enacted over winter. Now, our data on social services support and also what we've learned from the experience of accommodating people through Everyone In, that clearly shows that when local authorities and legal advice providers and the Home Office all work together, then a person can achieve a sustainable outcome whilst they're provided with stable accommodation. And we know that in most cases that when people have lived in the UK for a long period of time, this outcome is going to be a grant of leave rather than return to country of origin. So these proposals to introduce a new NRPF category and to remove Home Office support from people when their appeal rights exhausted certainly risk undermining local authority efforts to reduce the inequalities that have been caused by the NRPF condition, and I think also leave government with the important question of whether rough sleeping can truly be ended for everybody by the target date, which I think is 2027. And then of course it's going to be local authorities, not the Home Office or central government, that carry all the financial risk when intervention to prevent homelessness is absolutely essential to save lives and safeguard the welfare of children.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. And it's very useful to have your expertise on this panel, because NRPF remains one of the most complex areas that we're all dealing with. And of course, since the standard benefit system was made unavailable to people who were refugees in the early 2000s, I think it's 2003 that policy was implemented. Totally agree, we've seen this ramping up of the challenges that many people face in the response from local government that is required. So I'm now going to ask our next speaker, Rupinder Pahar, to take the floor, and she's going to reflect on some of the best practices for local government. So Rupinder, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to try and keep to time as well. So I'm just going to build, I think, a bit on some of the stuff that Catherine was saying, particularly the impact for local government, but also more widely what needs to happen through the Home Office. So thanks for having me today. There's a number of proposals in the new plan for immigration which not only risk increasing destitution among people that are in the immigration system, but also increasing the number of people that are approaching local authorities for destitution assistance due to this situation that they're being put in. And Catherine has spoken through two of the main provisions through which we're going to see this happening. So one is a temporary status where people will have the NRPF condition applied to their leave. And the second is bringing in these provisions from the 2016 Act for people that are appeal rights exhausted. The problem is obviously, again, as Catherine's mapped out, no recourse to public funds already creates significant burdens for local authorities. And it's not that they're getting comparable funding to meet that need through central government. And what we found, certainly in the work that we do at the GLA and the Mayor of London's work, is that it's important to actually create the routes to settlement for people and make it easier for people to resolve their status, not simply because there is often a moral duty to do so or a legal responsibility, especially when a local authority is supporting somebody, but it is certainly financially prudent. It supports children and families to thrive. And certainly when we're thinking about the sort of people that we're talking about here that have often a long-term right to be in the country, particularly those affected by NRPF on the family migration routes, it's counterintuitive and certainly counterproductive to be making life more difficult for them. And of course, when we're talking about London, I know someone said in the comments already that this is too southeast focused, so apologies for contributing to that further, but London does have proportionately the most undocumented migrants already, comparable to the rest of the country. The Mayor of London published research back in 2020, which found that well, it's obviously an estimate because you can't get hard figures on this, but we've estimated that there's around 397,000 undocumented adults and children living in London. And of that, 107,000 are children. And I think around 26,000 are young people. That number has drastically increased since research was last done into this back in 2012. And there's a number of government policies that have likely contributed towards that. So obviously we had the cuts to immigration legal aid that happened in 2012, were implemented in 2013, drastically increasing Home Office fees over the last decade. As has been found in litigation over the last year, we have among the highest citizenship fees for children in the world, but you can also see a comparable increase in all other routes to settlement and the fees through those routes. And then also just the immigration system being made more complex. So we have things like the 10-year route that was introduced in 2012 that forces people to constantly be reapplying for leave, costing thousands of pounds at a time every 2.5 years until they've accrued enough leave to be able to apply for indefinite leave to remain. I mean, this is totally financially unsustainable for many people, and people find that they're falling out of routes to settlement. So there's also a question of when we're talking about people that are undocumented, often it's actually the systems and the routes to settlement that actually, you know, force people out from being able to resolve their status. What happens when we have an immigration system that is increasingly difficult for people to navigate is obviously that local authorities end up having to pick up more of the responsibilities to support people. And not just at the point where perhaps a case would be easy to resolve. Very often these cases are reaching a real crisis point before people actually go to the local authority for assistance. So there's also a question for central government to think about, is it financially prudent for them to leave it to this point where people are then facing significant harm actually and potential exploitation and other vulnerabilities? And again, you know, we're talking about people that might be domestic violence survivors, trafficking survivors, people with young children, people that have been rough sleeping. Does it make sense to actually leave it to this point where the local authority has to deal with something that's at a crisis point, rather than actually making it easier much earlier on in that process for them to access their rights, secure their status and be able to get on with their lives? So any sort of increase in precarity for migrants in the immigration system, I think it's really important for us to recognise that it also increases the pressures for local authorities. And instead of local authorities being able to fulfil their duties, such as under Section 17 for children in need, they end up having to provide a welfare safety net, which actually should be accessible through the mainstream welfare system. And just to flag, actually, the GLA has currently commissioned some research looking at the cost impact of the NRPF policy, and also what might be the cost benefit of actually not applying this condition to so many people's leave to remain, which I'm sure we can share through this network once it's published. I just want to finish talking about some kind of examples of good practice. So Catherine mentioned that over the last year, local authorities have really stepped up in being able to support people through the Everyone In initiative. We've seen a really good movement among local authorities recognising that it's in their interest to fund immigration advice services for people, and more local authorities actually putting funding and resource back into doing that, where very often they might have done around 10 years ago, but due to cuts, they might have retracted funding for certain services, but there's more impetus towards funding immigration advice, which I think is really positive, and certainly a space for local government and civil society organisations to build stronger connections and work together for mutual interests. And in terms of future concerns, I know Catherine mentioned that there's potentially going to be a significant number of people that don't access their status through the EU settlement scheme in time. There's also people that are arriving in the country through the Hong Kong BNO route to access their rights to residence in the UK, which is great, but also, again, there needs to be real attention to where people are settling, what are the needs that they have, and making sure that immigration advice is crucially made available for them, as well as language support and destitution support. So yeah, I think there's good practice happening at the moment, but I think with this new plan for immigration and with future Home Office policy making, it's really important to understand that if you make an immigration system more difficult for people to access, those people don't disappear. They often are either within communities or presenting to local authorities, and very often at a point where it's actually quite difficult to resolve their cases and support them because it's been left so long, and they've really reached a crisis point. So it's prudent for us to think about how do we have early intervention, preemptive support, really trying to preempt crisis, and for the central government to recognise that they need to work with local authorities and civil society to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rupinder. I think it's very clear as we've gone on this journey from the shores of England, where people often arrive for the very first time to make their claim for asylum, to London, which is where they often go, particularly to have their asylum application processed, to then the wider implications of dispersal, which is where we see people often sent to quite far-flung parts of the country away from where they first made that application, where we have local authorities, particularly in the north, in Scotland, in Wales, finding it enormously challenging to ensure they have the support in place. And Glasgow has been an example of somewhere that has 100% stepped up to the plate, has made it a real political priority to engage with that. So, Councillor Leyden, you're going to share a bit of your experience both in Glasgow and also your perspective from that on the national picture, and perhaps some ideas about how you think the new plan could be improved in order to better reflect what you want to see happening in your community. Jeff.
Thank you very much for that, Chair, and thank you for the invite today. Sorry, I just fixed my iPad there. I think it's really important for us, to be able to come along and share some of our experiences in Glasgow. We are, as you've said in your opening statement, the only dispersal centre within Scotland, although we have had successful experiences with the Syrian refugee programme. But I think there is some issues that we really feel that we need to highlight, and issues that have particularly become exacerbated via COVID. We are committed to asylum dispersal within the city, and we have absolutely excellent third sector and public sector colleagues that really work hard to be able to deliver for our asylum seekers and refugees. However, we do have concerns, particularly around accommodation pressures, financial support, mental health and wellbeing support. And so I'll just touch on some of these very briefly because, Catherine and Rupinder have mentioned quite a lot about NRPF policy, which was something I was specifically going to highlight. We do have long-standing concerns about NRPF policy on poverty and destitution within the city. We do believe that we will see an increase in the numbers of people who present as destitute within our city as a result of the new immigration plan. For us in Glasgow, the most acute needs we have are those who are being refused support from the asylum system, and it means that they don't have access to the safety net of our homelessness system, so social welfare and even emergency crisis funds that we have available through the local authority. During COVID, we have been able to help more people on public health grounds, but we need to point out that this is temporary, and the financial pressure of resourcing these powers to our local authority is significant in terms of all the additions that we have in terms of COVID recovery. We can only provide support to destitute families, children and adults with care needs with our social work powers. If they don't have these needs, then we can't provide that assistance even when they're homeless or destitute. Our main concerns is, the number of people who are unsafe within the city because of no recourse to public funds, with risk of sleeping rough, going without food, or risk of trafficking and exploitation. And that is something, for example, that our Violence Against Women's Partnership, which I chair, is currently looking specifically at this issue in terms of particularly sexual exploitation. Scottish Government COSLA have produced an anti-destitution strategy for the next 3 years, taking a human rights approach, but it is that aim on prevention and partnership working and personalisation of plans to help support people as early as possible within the system. Somebody else had highlighted the impact of the EU Settled Status Scheme, and we also have concerns that will put additional pressure on us in terms of providing housing and other services to those with children and adult social care needs. I think one of the biggest things for us is around financial support for the Asylum Dispersal Scheme, and I think we've long had conversations about this, David, at LGAs in terms of having fair funding for those who are participating within the Asylum Dispersal programme. We do have a lot of our third sector partners who step in and help assist where local authorities can't, providing emergency accommodation and support when we can't cover them in statutory services. So I think really our asks are around needing changes to NRPF rules as one of our first instances. But I think more importantly for us is that we need to have a fairer funding system so that we can support people before they reach crisis point. The cost to local authorities of asylum dispersal is huge, and it's growing, and it is placing placing our services under huge and severe pressure. And we do have evidence that we can provide directly, and have done so to the Home Office, about the cost to the local authorities. Now, I just, I know we have been asked in the past about asking other local authorities in Scotland to take on asylum dispersal, and what we would say is that we can't really help convince other local authorities to do that when they see the issues that we are coming up against in Glasgow. But I know some of that does sound quite negative, but I do want to, sort of finish on this point. Glasgow welcomes refugees and asylum seekers, and we are really looking for ways to work constructively with the Home Office. But I think that there does need to be more meaningful engagement, particularly at a political level. I think we were very disappointed that the consultation period for the new immigration plan fell during our purdah period for the Scottish parliamentary elections, and that is a great disappointment to us because we weren't able to fully engage. So we would be asking that there is more engagement with local authorities and third sector, and this is taken seriously and prioritised, because it is something that we do want to work in partnership with to provide the best to asylum seekers that come to our city. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Leyden, for sharing your experience with us. I particularly would welcome Lord Dubbs and Baroness Ludford, who joined the call, who I know have an enormous interest which they've expressed in Parliament in the issues that we're here to discuss. Now, we're going to have a bit of time for some questions, and I think the aim with that is to explore some of the issues around no recourse to public funds, local government burden, so the impact that this all has, the lessons that come from coronavirus, and also the government's ambition for a global resettlement scheme. So to move from the lessons learned about Syrian resettlement programme to something which is broader. What that means for the UK's role in the wider world. Does that mean we're going, for example, beyond those countries where we've traditionally been involved? So if I may, I'm going, because I have to contribute to a parliamentary debate, hand the chair of the session over to Laura on behalf of RAMP, and I'm going to be following with great interest what's said, and hopefully we'll be rejoining the conversation shortly.
Thanks very much, David, and hello everybody. Yeah, I will take over the chair and take some of these questions. I'm going to move first of all to a couple of the ones we've had in the chat box. Councillor Danny Myers, do you want to read out the question that you have and bring that into the room? And if anyone else would like to raise a hand or add a question to the box, I'll keep an eye out for those and bring people in after that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm relatively new to the agenda, and I'm just trying to understand things. But so from what I've heard so far, the consensus is that the bill will, by design, mean more people will have no recourse to public funds. On top of those, and there's already an increased risk of that because of the EU Resettlement Scheme. A lot of these people, obviously, as people have said, are already exposed to really difficult working conditions and destitutions anyway. So this means we're above all other concerns, placing a lot more people at risk of destitution in the UK. And secondly, asking local authority services and budgets and putting them under a lot more pressure. And local authorities, as someone who is on an executive of one in Leicester, we already know that we have to manage, have already managed cuts for the last 11 years. I have to know that we have to manage more cuts in the next 2 or 3 years. But this is obviously going to apply a lot more pressure on our services when we've got less budgets. Is that a kind of accurate understanding for someone who is arriving new to this and trying to understand the impact of the immigration bill on a city which has been a very enthusiastic participant in the resettlement scheme, and is very willing to help help the UK provide opportunities and services to refugees.
Thanks for that question. I'm guessing you're looking to other people who from the panel to share their
of course.
reflections
How
that resonates with them. So if anyone would like to take that question or add their comments to that, please feel free.
Yeah, I would just say that's absolutely spot on. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what everybody's feeling really, and really kind of whether the plan gives rise to destitution risks, it kind of rides a lot on whether what the Home Office states they want to happen in the plan actually happens in practice, and that's really reliant on agreements with other European countries around returns. It's also around people actually taking up return voluntarily if they have their Home Office support withdrawn from them, and we've seen no evidence that behaviour change would happen based on other services that get switched off from people without status, and also from the people that we support through it when social services provisions are engaged. I mean, ultimately we know that the majority of those will be resolved through grants of status rather than return, so it's very difficult to see how the plan would lead to anything other happening, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Did any of the other panelists want to come in on that point?
I just think to say, Laura, that I would agree with that assessment. We have been not struggling, probably isn't the word I want to use, but we are stretched in our resources in the local authority, and I think that is becoming more stretched as we're coming out of the pandemic. So yeah, it is something we've been fighting for a long time at Glasgow City Council, is a better funding arrangement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I noticed in the comments there was a bit of a conversation going about the relationship between the third sector and local government, and I know there's a number of people from the third sector in this meeting. I just wondered, either Amber, if you wanted to bring that question or that point that you made in the chat to the room, or if anyone else wanted to ask a question related to local authorities and the third sector.
Yeah, it was just an observation really, just from what's been said so far about local authorities and concerns about their budgets and the additional pressures that this will put on them. And as we know already, there's a very active third sector for destitution, rough sleeping, asylum seekers, homelessness, and as we know, it's a very unregulated sector. The training of staff is very varied. The levels of support aren't always, we can't guarantee that it's going to be a statutory level of support that somebody's given. And as a result, it's putting more people at risk of poor support, because it's going to be handed back from the Home Office, handed back from local authorities into the hands of people that, have got no kind of threshold on what training they should have, experience, qualifications and skills that they should have to work in the third sector. So, I guess that's just an additional risk on top of the risks that the local authorities are highlighting here. And it's, again, we work for an anti-slavery sector organisation, and the increases of exploitation that come with destitution and failed asylum seekers are already vast. And it is a concern that we'll see that increase even more so, especially with increased NRPF provision.
Thanks, Amber. Did any of the panelists want to build on or respond to those comments at all?
Can I come in on that one? Yeah, just to say, obviously, also though, third sector organisations have really stepped into a space where they have worked endlessly, tirelessly to actually support people that are struggling through the immigration system and facing destitution, exploitation, etc. So voluntary sector organisations, yes, there is certainly a number where people may have provided unregulated advice, but actually you've got real experts in these issues, and especially when you come to the immigration advice sector, very few people that have got the training and the resource. There are programs like the Refugee Action Programme to increase OASC capacity. I know someone mentioned that in the chat. So that's where they offer free advice and coaching for organisations to get up to either level 1, 2 or 3 in their work, and that's available nationally. Also, local authorities certainly have been trying to think about how they can fund voluntary sector organisations in their area. So either to be providing training or guidance to other partner organisations. So perhaps somebody that is, working in a school setting or midwife, etc., to make sure they understand if someone's presenting with immigration needs, where they should refer them. So strengthening those referral pathways in a local area, I think, is really vital, and where local authorities can support that. But also in actually directly funding immigration advice services, because it's not only in the interest of the individual, but also often in the interest of local authorities to actually directly fund that immigration advice with specialist providers. I think there's also another question of, even among immigration advisors, how do we make sure people are skilled up? So when you're dealing with children's cases, there's a particular level of expertise, or domestic violence, etc., how to make sure that anyone that's providing advice also is skilled up to a particular level to respond to really specialist cases. So yeah, I think voluntary sector organisations often go above and beyond in supporting, and there's more work to be done in strengthening the connections between local government and NGO organisations.
Could I just add a point, which is one feature also of the plan, of course, is the emphasis on community sponsorship, which has played such a significant role in the resettlement schemes, and in many cases has worked well. But I think there is a bit of a question mark again. So often with the plan, it's a question of, okay, what detail now lies behind this, and how will it work in practice? And the question there is, yes, community sponsorship schemes in a number of areas have worked well. Whether they would necessarily be the route by which you would extrapolate out to cover a much larger section of that, a moot point. And what it does, to go back to the point that was just being made, the relationship then between community sponsors and local authorities still look like, because there will still be a close and important relationship there. So I think, like a lot of these areas, there's something set out in the plan which you'd really want to see a lot more detail on before you made a full judgment.
Thanks very much, Roger. I see Satvinder has a hand raised, but I just wanted to bring in Zoe, because I think Zoe's question in the chat follows on quite nicely from what you were just saying, Roger. Zoe, did you want to just bring that into the room as well?
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I thank you to all the speakers, really important points made. And I just wondered whether, I'm sure that there would be a response from government that, the intention of this plan is to disincentivize anybody coming to seek asylum in the UK, and therefore that numbers would go down, and whether there's any evidence or any reason to have any confidence from panelists that that aim is going to be achieved by this plan at all.
I don't know, Roger, if you wanted to.
Yeah, do you want me to come back on that?
Yeah, sure.
Clearly the aim of it is to shift the, if you like, shift the balance of incentives, if you can put it that way. So it is on the one side to produce, if you like, a harsher response in many ways, hence all what we've been talking about on NRPF, to those who arrive by routes other than the resettlement one. And then there are clearly one or two smaller, you might say, carrots. I mean, the resettlement numbers are not talked about, so how much it builds on or expands the resettlement schemes of recent years is a moot point. But also there are proposals for leave to remain to be granted straight off, and that's clearly meant to sort of make that a more attractive alternative. I think one of the great difficulties on this, and it goes back to also, it's linked to the kind of debates that there've been, and I hate to be parochial, but over what we've seen in terms of arrivals on the coast over the last year or so, and particularly actually in relation to children in this case, the argument is, can safe legal routes provide a substitute for that? And I think the answer is, in theory, yes. In practice, extremely hard to do, because there are a whole number of other things that would then have to slot in to actually make that work. So would you have effective returns agreements with other countries? Would the anything done through resettlement or other agreed processes by which you took people actually be on a scale And how would you work that out? It's not as if there's always a fixed and predictable number of people coming through, if you like, into the system. So and clearly there's a whole question over what some of the legal challenges may well be to elements of this. So I think it would take quite a number of additional conditions to be confident that it would achieve that aim.
Thanks, Roger. Does anyone else on the panel want to come in on that question?
I think I'd just add that a lot of immigration policies are justified by being perceived as pull factors to the UK, you know, sort of switching off access to benefits, for example, is seen as a pull factor, so therefore it's legitimate to switch that off. And I don't think I've seen any kind of detailed evidence or research that has really analysed whether these particular policies are pull factors or not. So I think it's an incredibly difficult question to answer. I think there is a big unknown, and I don't think we can kind of rely on things happening as they are set out in the plan.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. We're starting to get more questions now, so I'm going to bring in two. Satvinder, if you could ask your question, and then Pierre, you raised an interesting point about amnesties. Maybe you could just raise that question after Satvinder has, if that's okay. Satvinder?
Yeah, I guess my question was just in relation to what Rupinder was saying. And I guess it is around the financial systems, but also the expectations that we then place on the voluntary and community sector to then provide that free immigration service. And it goes back to the questions within the chat around the recognition of the Home Office for the cost that it does incur local resources, more than just local authorities, it's the local resources, and then the expectations of local authorities to then work with the voluntary sector to provide that destitution support that falls outside statutory duty, and the implications for that within considering their processes, especially around negative cessations and the decisions that people can make. You know, if the decision's been made, then how do we safeguard those individuals who then become hidden homeless? So I guess those are lots of questions, but I just feel like there hasn't been any learning that's kind of underpinned all of this. And considering we've just come out of a pandemic and hotels are still backlogged of individuals that were here in the UK that had come through our immigration system, and now we've got no routes to actually move them on into more safe and sustainable accommodation or options, there's no consideration given into that for anything, to be honest.
Rupinder or Jen, was there any other points that you wanted to sort of weave onto Satvinder's?
I think that, oh, sorry. I think that's a really important point. I am understanding the whole systems approach to asylum dispersal and refugee integration. It's not just about one partner, it's about what happens across the entire process from start to finish. And I think one of the things, you know, that is really important, and a couple of people have touched on it, it's around that prevention, you know, making sure that we're getting in and supporting people early. You know, if you're wanting to take it purely from that financial aspect, then you're probably actually, you know, saving a lot more money and funding and able to route that to people who really need it if we get in there early and help to integrate from day one. And I do have to say, you know, our third sector partners in Glasgow are absolutely phenomenal. And to be honest, I don't think we could deliver an asylum dispersal, you know, centre without our third sector partners. The knowledge they have is second to none. But yes, I do think we need to map the entire process, and also, you know, we also need to look at other things such as the right to work as well. I know nobody's really mentioned that here, but these are all things that will help in delivering a humane and a dignified and fair immigration system.
Thanks, Jen. Rupinder, do you want to come in as well? Oh, I think we may have lost her. In that case, I'm going to come to you, Pierre. You had a question around amnesty.
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. Being a refugee myself, I don't understand how to be in the country without a document. And I heard what Rupinda said about the number of people who have no documents in this country. So I understand the attention, the frustration they might be going, the difficulties that they might be going through. Then in 2000, I think 2012, there was this plan of amnesty, general amnesty to people who without documents. And my thought was, why, if we can advocate back for that plan to get people, at least those who are here already, been in the country, kind of integrated already, to allow them the general amnesty.
Great, thank you. I'm just spotting in the chat as well that Baroness Ludford has got some really interesting political context as a response to that question. Maybe I could bring you in, Baroness Ludford.
Sorry, I couldn't resist replying to that because it's rather a long time ago now, of course, 11 years, but my recollection is that it was a Liberal Democrat proposal in the 2010 election. It wasn't a coalition agreement, sadly, and I can't remember all the caveats and conditions that we suggested, but I think they included having been 10 years in the UK, not having a criminal record, and there were others I can't remember. But I do remember we got absolutely, I use the expression, hammered for it. We were completely put on the rack by the press, and probably not just by the Conservatives, among other parties. I add in the chat that I still think it was right. I mean, you've got problems of selling it to voters, but I think that you could to have a practical as well as humane response to a large problem. But given the experience that we had 11 years ago, I do wonder whether anybody else is going to grapple with that particular difficult challenge.
Thanks very much for that context. And I see in the chat there's been lots of other responses about campaigns that are ongoing in that area, which hopefully will be useful. We are rapidly running out of time. Alessandra had made some interesting points in the chat about the relationship between different local authorities and the third sector. And I just wondered if you wanted to highlight any of those, Alessandra.
Yes, thanks, Laura. Yeah, I mean, the one that I was involved with, and I think Hera is currently at Laura mentioned, she might be able to say a little bit more about where it is currently. It was to mention the Lewisham Borough of Sanctuary campaign, which started a few years ago. And I think that was a really positive experience of how local authorities can work with a community organisation, both in terms of providing funding for free immigration advice, particularly for people with no recourse public funds, but also in terms of committing to broader policy changes from allowing children of NRPF parents to access free school meals and other kind of examples. So I think that is a really good example of how a good relationship can work. But I think that what I meant to say in the comment is that I didn't mean to say that it was a pull factor, absolutely. It's more to say that it's often down to luck. Unfortunately, where people end up, and if they do live in a borough where the council, the local authority is very committed to supporting migrants and refugees, that's great. And other local authorities, they're not as lucky, unfortunately. So yeah, it's really just to raise awareness about that. But I think Hera might be able to say more about where the campaign is at the moment, because I haven't been involved for a little while. Sorry to put you in a spot, Hera.
I don't need to go. I think Alessandra's summarized it really well, and I don't need to go into, and the campaign is ongoing and it is going really well, but I think it's really important. Like Lewisham is probably the exception to the rule. Like it's quite a special borough, and if you just move just one borough down to Bexley or to Greenwich, it's a very different story. So it does seem to be luck of the draw. It depends what kind of political motivations. I mean, Lewisham also has a long-standing history of,
Windrush, relationship with, and migration and political movements, and a really close relationship with the council and community movement. So it's in places like that when something special like Lewisham can happen. But it just also does show the potential of what local authorities can do and how far they can go, because they not only work locally to make things better, they also actually have been putting a lot of pressure on central government, and it shows that local authorities can also be a political voice, which is sometimes we forget that they have that power.
Thank you. And that feels like an incredibly important point to end on as well, focusing on the positives and the voice they can have. We've had an excellent group of panelists, really provoking good conversation. Just want to go back to our panelists, say, are there any final points that you didn't get a chance to raise or that you wanted to come back on before we close?
Nothing from me.
Okay, well, it just leaves me then to say, in David's absence, thank you again for the huge amount of wisdom that you shared in your presentations. And it was just a real privilege to be joined by such a wide range of people from local authorities and the third sector and Parliament with different viewpoints on this issue. Obviously, with the new plan for immigration and the forthcoming legislation, it's something that this APPG will be keeping a very close eye on. This session has looked very much at local government. Our next session will be thinking about the global context for the new plan for immigration in early July, and we'll be in touch about that and hope to see some of you there. But thank you again for making the time to join this discussion today. We will be sharing a recording and the notes from the chat as well through our email and social media channels. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.